Hello everyone, and welcome to a somewhat weird stream today. My only real animation work that I've been doing recently was some title cards for a toolkit video, but due to other circumstances, I was not willing and able to stream that. Also, it wouldn't have been terribly interesting. I think I've streamed that before, actually, so there wouldn't have been anything new. The main thing I've been working on these past few weeks is an outline for, well, notes and an outline for our episode 21 of Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong, which is going to be Archaeopteryx, which is why I have this second camera up here. I'm going to be trying to hash through my notes to figure out how this episode flows and where I can reorganize things. But I get to talk about dinosaurs, so that's exciting. Really need to research who sent me, actually, the two Papo. Well, actually, I don't even know if this one is Papo. It looks like the Papo one, but it's of much inferior manufacturing quality. But I actually have 3 toys this time. We have a previous episode where I had once... I can't figure out which episode it was, but I said something like, and I'll totally talk about Archaeopteryx if someone would please send me an Archaeopteryx. And lo and behold, 3 different people send me Archaeopteryx. I guess we'll just go. Birds are dinosaurs, and overemphasizing the differences between them reinforces misconceptions people might have about phylogenetics and about Archaeopteryx specifically, because it puts pressure on this animal, sort of, and people restoring this animal, to make it more of a missing link than it was necessarily. There's a tendency, you can see it especially with the Papo toy here, that they have gone a little bit out of their way to make it a bird with dinosaur traits. Especially, this is a very pretty interpretation of it, but this has a lot of old tropes on display. The hands sprouting out of the wings, the lizard-like face and neck, and the very primitive theropod-like toes. Although I do like that it has the tarsal scoops. That's nice. But there is that tendency. We exaggerate how birdy the bird-like parts are, and we exaggerate how reptile-like the reptilian parts are, when this was much more gentle of a transitional fossil, further research has revealed. This even extends to a degree to the animal's mechanics and biology, because some of this goes back to the Linnaean taxonomy, where it has feathers, therefore it is a bird, therefore it has bird-like characteristics. We tend to think that it's going to have flapping flight and parental care, and there's a moose here who wants something. Hello.
I just wanted to show you.
Cool. What is it?
It's what we're going to put on the front door.
Oh, excellent.
It doesn't have the docks because those are a separate assembly,
That makes sense.
but this is 10 colors of vinyl stacked on top of each other.
I can't even tell. Very nice.
I thought you'd appreciate that.
Yes. Sometimes people show me things that have been based on things I did that are being implemented, and it's rewarding and stuff. Anyway, we tend to assume that because it's a bird, it's going to be able to flap its wings and fly. We assume that it will be taking care of its young, it'll grow up really fast like a bird does, and it'll, this ties into the growth rate, it'll have a avian, warm-blooded, endothermic metabolism. The flapping flight might be accurate. In any case, these assumptions are not reflective of the evidence any more than the exaggerations of its appearance are reflective of the evidence. Now, this is kind of reflective of a larger problem in our perception of stem birds. There are gaps in our fossil record, but it's much more of a gradient going from very bird-like theropods to, I guess, theropod-like birds, if you'll excuse the paradox. So you'll notice that in some of the earlier episodes of dinosaurs, I would pause a lot when I was saying things, and that's because I was trying to find ways to link together somewhat disparate thoughts. And that's what was just happening here. And that's exactly the kind of thing I try to cut out more, if I can, in these more recent episodes. So the problem I'm having right now is I'm talking about its appearance, and then I transition into talking about its behavior in the context of declaring my thesis, which is not really... I should probably lay out my thesis beforehand. Because I talk about it right here, but maybe I should lead with that. That we tend as, not so much paleontologists, but definitely the general public and to an extent paleo artists tend to make Archaeopteryx into something it's not in service of making it the avialin. I should write that down. All right, so that was pretty good. What did I say? Paleo artists. There's a thrilling stream. Watch as I type into Notepad. Oh, hi, Sam Sitar. Okay. I think part of this is that I'm kind of saying, first off, I got derailed a little bit because some of the stuff that I was mentioning, especially with regards to the specifics of the toy, I don't need to go into detail on it because I'm going to go into detail on it later. Do I even need to mention these? It might be good to mention them for repetition's sake. Contingency, okay. Yeah, this is a slightly different, this whole block is a slightly different thought than the one that I'm trying to express here, which is the, I've got two basic goals for this episode, which is talk about Archaeopteryx specifically and talk about the transition from the more basal Maniraptora to the aves. And I want to talk about it in the context of explaining a little bit about how cladistics work, but I haven't refined that part of the episode yet. It's still over here. Yeah, over here. I've got like I have a glossary, but I don't know in what order I need to talk about these just yet. I think this section is going to be especially heavy on graphics. I'm gonna show like, I might not even use dinosaurs for this. I think I'm going to do something like shapes. I'll have like a homology, and I'll have a cladogram with blobs on either end, and both blobs have a triangle. And then a plesiomorphy is that both blobs have a square, and there's a square in the basal position, and stuff like that. I think abstraction is going to be helpful in this case, especially for the younger viewers. But let's see. So I should definitely mention the stuff about the phylogeny and the cladistics, but I don't want to get bogged down because this is technically still the intro, and it's way too long already. Microcosm of larger problems in the perception of the stem bird gradient. There are gaps in the fossil record that we have not yet filled in, and the transition from dinosaurs that are bird-like to true birds is abrupt, geologically speaking, but we have a good idea of what that gradient is. Because, okay, there's a because there. And this is the why. Because we can use phylogenetics to reconstruct the evolutionary transitions, even or especially without Rosetta Stones like Archaeopteryx, because we don't recover those every day. Something like that. This I kind of talk about already. I think I got this straight from Andrea Kaw, or at least from the Google Translate of Andrea Kaw. All fossils are transitional, and none are. I'm keeping this part though, because I do want to take that, there's that famous graphic of the caveman, it's not even a caveman, it's like a monkey walking, and then with each step, it's a little more evolved towards modern man. I want to rearrange that into a cladogram. I recognize that most people are probably aware that that should be a branched process if you're going to present it like that, but I think it'll illustrate my point. All right. Okay, so we don't need that. I don't know if I need to say this here, though. I think it's better off. Yeah. I recognize that Notepad++ is probably not the best program to be using for a screenwriting outline, but it's, I guess, what I'm used to. Let's see. All right, I'll give this another run. So Archaeopteryx, as with any dinosaur that we've known about for as long as we have, has had some trouble with its image. Not so much paleontologists, but we, the public, and to an extent paleoartists and seemingly toy makers, struggle with trying to pigeonhole it into being the archetypal avialin, which it really isn't. It's its own animal. Birds are dinosaurs. So overemphasizing the differences between them is reinforcing some misconceptions, and it's putting unfair pressure on Archaeopteryx to bridge a gulf that doesn't exist. This results in things like exaggerating how reptilian the reptilian parts of Archaeopteryx are, and conversely making the bird parts more birdy as well. It even extends to parts of the animal's mechanics and biology. It is a bird, therefore it must have bird-like traits. It must have bird-like movement. Or even in the literature, there's some of this where the origin of flight is inexorably tied up with how Archaeopteryx moved around its environment. So it's kind of a microcosm of the larger problems that we have with the basal paravians. Now, there are gaps in that gradient from dinosaurs to birds, and I recognize that birds are dinosaurs, so that's a weird dichotomy to use, but oh, I know what I should do. I do like the term basal paravians because it's kind of a cop-out, because if I say basal paravians, you can't say that Anchiornis is a troodontid without immediately dating your video as soon as they figure out that it isn't one again. But if I say basal paravians, well, I didn't say which specific group it is in. Mark McGough says Notepad++ is the best. Well, that's good to know, Mark McGough. You'll notice that I have a lot of complete sentences in here. That's another thing that's going to get trimmed as I work through, which is I need to be able to glance at this rather than just read it, which is, I'm mostly reading it right now, if you couldn't tell. Oh man, Sam Sitar with the rebuttal. I guess that's not really a rebuttal, it's more of a request for clarification. We have a tendency to exaggerate the birdiness of the bird-like parts and to make the reptilian parts really stereotypically dinosaurian. So traditionally we have this long-tailed bird with a reptile head and dinosaur hands sticking out of the wings, not necessarily supporting feathers on the fingers. And this extends to the animal's mechanics, its biology. We assume that because it's a bird, it's going to have warm-bloodedness, it's going to have really fast growth, it's going to care for its young, and it's going to have flapping flight. None of those might be true. In any case, this stereotyping is not reflective of the evidence. We don't have to try so hard to show, look, it's a dinosaur-bird link. It's kind of a microcosm of larger problems in the basal paravians and interpretations thereof. There are gaps in the fossil record, and the transition from dinosaurs to birds is abrupt, geologically speaking, but we have a pretty good idea of what that gradient was, and we know what kinds of animals would appear at those nodes that we have only reconstructed hypothetically. Because we can use phylogenetics to reconstruct the evolutionary transitions, especially because Rosetta Stone-like fossils, like Archaeopteryx was, we don't get those every day. We very rarely find something that could be described as a missing link fossil. And Sam Sitar, the point of the video is that it's not a bird with dinosaur parts. Really, it's more like a dinosaur with bird parts, if you're going to get technical, and I suppose I should. I wonder if I should say that. It's not a bird with dinosaur parts, it's a dinosaur with bird parts. To be fair, that could be describing any number of the Paravians. That could be describing the Deinonychosaurs, that could be describing the Microraptors, Troodon. Yeah, if you want a bird with dinosaur parts, you'd want something like Balaur that was recently described. It's I mention it further down here. It's an island species or genus that secondarily developed some Deinonychosaur-like traits. It had 2 sickle claws instead of just 1. It was smaller than a Deinonychus, though. Mark McGough, that is exactly how I use Notepad++, so I guess I'm using it for its intended purpose. So now I'm considering this kind of, talking about how Archaeopteryx is a Rosetta Stone, that sets me up to talk about the history of discovery, which I have somewhere in here. All right. Oh, I structured this kind of weird, didn't I? And I wrote a lot. Okay. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to read it, and then I'm gonna revise it. All right. I like how much has been written about Archaeopteryx, that I have all of these links, and most of them are studies. All right. Jesus. All right. That's a lot of stuff. So let's see here. Ah! No! Well, that'll tide you over while I get the thing back up. There we go. Totally forgot that I needed to keep the camera running. Anyway. Not going to be much video for this portion anyway, but here, look at that Archaeopteryx. Look at that Archaeopteryx there. If anybody remembers who sent me any of these, that would be great. It was Laura and Keith Baston, the same people that sent me one of the Allosaurus from last episode, that sent me the Safari Archaeopteryx. But I wrote down when I received these, but I did not write down the name of who sent them. Mark McGough says, yeah, Stephen, is that a cannon? Yes, it is a cannon. What is this thing? It's a Rebel. It's a T3i. It's a Rebel T3i. There's a configuration to make it... Oh, I can tell it not to auto power off? Okay, I should look into that. It didn't even occur to me that that would be a setting I could change. Yes, I will check that. Anyway. How do I... Okay, so... Because we can use phylogenetics to reconstruct that evolutionary transition, or that series of evolutionary transitions, especially since we don't get those really dramatic Rosetta Stone-like fossils that Archaeopteryx was every day. And then some manner of transition, something like, and it was a Rosetta Stone, let me tell you, something like that. The town of Solnhofen in Bavaria has been quarrying limestone industrially for over 200 years now. And here's a video of how that works by, I think it's British Path has it. Do I have to lead with that? Because I've got a lot of stuff in here about the actual environment of the site, which is relevant because it's talking about how that rock came to be. So how do I transition between this? Okay, so I guess I could just do something clunky like, and we don't get specimens like that every day. It was in 1836 that, oh wait. Now 1836 is slightly unrelated. 1855 is slightly unrelated as well because we thought it was a pterodactyl at first. See, I arranged this chronologically instead of conceptually, and I think I'm starting to think that was a mistake. You can tell I was largely drawing on Martin Week because I keep saying the word stem bird. 1861. Yes, because here I'm talking about Compsognathus, which is interesting but kind of straying from the point, isn't it? I think I should just say something like had recognized the birdiness of Compsognathus. Join us as Stephen thinks out loud for 2 hours. Because basically, conceptually, the two ways I can go with this are to just do it narratively, which is basically how I have it laid out. Say, well, 150 million years ago, in the early Tithonian, we laid down some rock, and some stuff got caught in it, and then blah, 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 humans dug it up. Or I think it'll be more natural to say, and I say it was a Rosetta Stone, or I say it was this watershed fossil because it was in 1861, just X years after Origin of Species was published, that we found first a single feather encased in the limestone, and then a full skeleton, or nearly complete skeleton, of Archaeopteryx from the Solnhofen quarry in Bavaria. It was pretty instantly recognized as an ancient bird, but the cool part was that it showed clearly reptilian features. It had, I don't think we had a skull at that point, but at least it had a long tail, it had a very reptilian chest, it still had claws on its wings. Oh, thank you, Sam Sitar. He says my thinking out loud is very informative. Oh my gosh. Didn't occur to me that I'll have to... Langenaltheim. Langenaltheim. Langenaltheim? Team? Time? I think it's time. Do we have to trace the history of the fossil itself, Stephen? It is a neat little story that the London specimen may have been given to this doctor in exchange for his services as a physician. This story would be somewhat familiar to, you know, Moroccan and Chinese paleo workers. This one I kind of do want to mention because it's silly that the guy who had the Berlin specimen knew it was valuable, and the only guy who could really afford it was Siemens of the Siemens Corporation. Which is why one of the species of Archaeopteryx is called Siemensii. I think it's this species, in fact. Or at least I believe this toy to be based on the Berlin specimen, and the Berlin specimen is Siemensii. Although some people think that there's only Lithographica as a species of Archaeopteryx. Dr. Holtz thinks that one species is perfectly serviceable. Pardon. I'm running out of momentum here. I'm going to come back to this portion. I'm going to try and hash out some of the stuff about the actual toys. Plus, that's more forgiving because I'm going to be using a lot more animation for this segment anyway. Let's see. Which one am I looking at here? So the Papo toy is actually quite beautifully detailed. I like how much work went into the texture of the feathers and how they transition between scales and feathers. So it kind of breaks my heart that I have to tell them that all those details are wrong. It has the stereotypical monitor lizard looking face. It even has it doing, you know, a stereotypical dinosaur rah face at us. The neck and at least parts of the head should have long pennaceous feathers. I understand the tendency to emphasize the reptilian traits, but the fact that it has a sort of dinosaur-shaped head and, you know, teeth do that on their own. You can tell that it's a dinosaur without having to give it lizard face. We know from other basal paravians that feathered heads were the ancestral condition, so even though we don't have direct feather traces for Archaeopteryx's head specifically, it's more reasonable to restore it with feathers than without. To that end, these both kind of suffer from too skinny of necks. They have, I'm going to move the mic a little closer to my face. They have slightly shrink-wrapped, to use a paleo art term, look to their necks. If you look at how a bird's neck, unless it's, you know, a flamingo or something, is covered in its floof, you're going to see less of the contour of the actual throat and spine and more of just a transition between neck and head. You're not going to see that abrupt shelf between neck and head. I don't know what they're basing. But both of these have some kind of crest. The safari one has this mohawk, and the Papo has this, I don't know what. They appear to be some kind of quills. As far as I know, there is no evidence for either. I suppose it's not unreasonable. Actual living birds have crests. If we're just talking aesthetics, I think that the Papo one looks silly. So That's just my opinion, though, so I probably shouldn't include it in the episode. What do we got? Oh, I forgot to mention. So, where was I? I'm gonna move this up, since otherwise I apparently will forget it. Alright. Let's try that there. This Papo toy goes to a lot of trouble of having these very detailed textures for the feathers, and you can tell that they put a lot of work into making the scales have a different look than the feathers, which kind of breaks my heart to have to say that all of that detailing is wrong. We know from looking at other basal Paravians that the ancestral condition for the Avalians would be a feathered neck and a feathered head, at least partially feathered head. So it's kind of weird. The less detailed version of this toy comes out looking a little better because you can't see the change in texture between the neck and head, and both are colored blue. So as far as we can tell, this one does have feathers continuing all the way up to the head, whereas this guy does not. I don't know if I even need this part, the tendency to emphasize, because I already talked about that. Yeah, I'm just going to eliminate that for now. Right. Necks are both too emaciated. So I went on a bit of a tangent there about their crests. Not directly contradicted. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that, I think. I went on... I don't think it's really my place to be saying, oh, this one's better because it looks better. That's not really... It's not a review show. It's a science show. This is kind of a weird premise because usually I have two... The only other time I've had two toys, they were the same toy, whereas here I'm sort of comparing two different manufacturers. So it almost is a review show. Let's see. Moving from the neck to the body, which again would not have this abrupt of a transition because the feathers would smooth that out. The Papo... I like that I'm arranging these like they're actual ornithologist specimens. The Papo... No. The Safari torso winds up looking a lot more like an Archaeopteryx. The Papo toy looks like more of a Coelophysis or something, some kind of more basal theropod, whereas you want, even though it wasn't as heavily modified for flight as some of the more derived birds would have been, it would still have had a barrel chest like you see here, and it still would have had a ischial boot, which is barely present over in this guy. And if we keep on moving down into the tail, I believe that the tails are pretty accurate for length, although the Safari toy seems to have too short of rectrices, too short of tail feathers. I do think that the Papo toy is showing a little too much of the cauda muscle. The Safari toy comes out ahead because it's not showing this linkage between the legs and the tail. And we're going to get into this a little later, but the tail and legs were much more independent in the avialans than they were in more basal dinosaurs. Geez, between this and Allosaurus and Carnotaurus, this is turning into the Cauda femoralis hour. I've talked about that muscle every episode. I mean, it's an important muscle, so it's not like it's not relevant, but... Pardon me. I should probably lead with that. Should I mention Cauda femoralis by name, or should I just, yeah. I'll talk later about how the legs becoming yeah. Not reflected in paper toy. And the reason I put this here is that I want to talk about how the safari's tail feathers are too short, and then go right into, well, what are the tail feathers for? What are the rectrices for? Let's see here. Okay, so I'll start that over, okay. Moving from the body to the tail, the safari toy comes out ahead again because the transition from tail to body is much more theropod-like in the Papo toy, and that's not accurate. The muscle groups, we're going to talk about this in a bit, but the tail was much more independent of the legs in Archaeopteryx and other avialans than the more basal theropods, and the Papo toy seems to be using the basal theropod style. Also, the safari toy seems to have too short of tail feathers. I think the tail on both these toys is pretty accurately proportioned. The tail feathers were bifurcated. There were 2 feathers per tail vertebra. And we actually found out recently with the 11th specimen that was described, unless it was a taphonomic artifact, there was a fork at the end of the tail. The 2 sides of the tail feathers actually split at the end, which is not reflected in these toys, but I don't know if I can fault them for that. I should make a note to mention when these were manufactured, if I could read. Yeah, these are 2014 and 2015. When is... Oh geez, now I can't even remember who described the 11th specimen. Was it Foth? I don't know if this is Foth or Foth. Doot 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 doot. Doot 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 doot. Yeah, this is the 11th. So in 2014 it was the 11th. So, all right, let's see. I might not mention this part, but I'm going to type it anyway. This is, again, getting a little into review territory. Right. Okay, so the tail feathers on Archaeopteryx are bifurcated. There's two rectrices per tail vertebra, per caudal vertebra. The end of the tail even is forked. We only recently found out, as of the description of the 11th specimen, that the feathers split at the end, unless it's a taphonomic artifact. And I can't really fault the Papo toy for not knowing that, since that was made the same year that the study came out, but I can fault the Safari toy. The Safari toy has this weird feature that I see in Longrich's restoration of the creature, but I couldn't figure out what that's actually based on, where it's got this sort of first diamond of feathers before it then flares out again towards the end of the tail. The Papo toy has the more traditional arrangement. I would like to know what that's based on, because it is a cool feature, but I just don't know. I should make a note to actually research that, because apparently I have not, or have not adequately. I think it's from the 2006 study, which I can't find online for free, anyway. I wonder if I could request it. There's like that, the ResearchGate has a request this study button. I wonder if he'd send it to me if I asked nicely. Excuse me. I am better now. All right. The rectrices on Archaeopteryx are asymmetrical. It's difficult to tell, but it looks like on the Safari toy they're restored as symmetrical. And yeah, they look symmetrical on the Papo toy as well. Now I realize I'm being a huge stickler with this because, you know, I have these toys that are so detailed that I can tell whether the feathers' veins are symmetrical, but they should be asymmetrical, and therefore they are wrong. The reason that they're asymmetrical is that they would provide some lift. There was a study that found that the tail would actually enable a lower takeoff velocity, assuming the animal was taking off. And you might say, well, why wouldn't it be taking off? It has wings, doesn't it? Well, yeah, but it also has legs. Let's talk about the legs. I believe the feet on the Papo figures are too long. That is, the foot from ankle to toes are not too long, too short. Especially when you look at the I think, more accurate proportion on the Safari toy. Wow, I'm really gonna have to be on the close-up camera on this one. I occasionally forget whether I'm showing properly towards that camera, but I don't think I have an excuse on this one because I'm showing some pretty specific stuff. Of course, I mean, that camera is pointed at the toy from this angle relative to me, whereas, you know, this one's this here, which is not what I'm used to. I suppose I could move this one, but my desk is angled, so that wouldn't work. Anyway, let's see. Right. The Papo toy altogether is trying to make the feet look a little too theropod-like. They look much more like I don't know, some kind of Compsognathus or something. Although I do like that they included the tarsal scutes. I don't even think. Difficult to say, but it doesn't look like the Safari included tarsal scutes. Right, the reversed hallux. So interestingly, even though I've been going on about how the Safari toy is much more up to date, they still have a reversed hallux on Archaeopteryx, which as of the 10th specimen, which is called the Thermopolis specimen, and it's not the Thermopylae specimen because I found out it's Thermopolis, Wyoming. This has a reversed hallux. Did I already say reversed hallux? Do I need to have an aside about Thermopolis, Wyoming? I think I do. But I get a little bent out of shape about Greek words anyway. Okay. So it's interesting. I've been going on about how the Safari toy is the much more up-to-date one, yet that's the one that retains the reversed hallux, which as of the 10th specimen, the Thermopolis specimen, named for Thermopolis, Wyoming, not Thermopylae in Greece, we've been seeing how the first toe in all of these admittedly crushed, partially disarticulated specimens that we have of Archaeopteryx is reversed as a taphonomic artifact. It was not reversed in life. We can tell that by looking at how the joint, what kind of movement the joint allows. It would be much more like what the Papo toy shows, even though the Papo toy has too short of a first toe. It would be medial rather than there's a word that means the back. Posteriorly directed. It will be medially directed, not posteriorly directed. Do I need to say that? I just thought of the word and I already posteriorly. I am so good at words. You guys have no idea. Cool. Oh, right. I'm thinking about what order I should talk about the feet, because, if I put the hallux stuff last, that lets me segue into some stuff about locomotion. Although, well, the wings give me more option to segue into locomotion. What if I used that as a jumping off point to talk about the Solnhofen ecosystem? Because we looked at pollen samples and we thought, and we think that there were very few trees, if any. Not that you need trees to be arboreal. You could be living in scrub or brush. Is there a reason that I couldn't just import that into the middle? Flora trunkless, no taller than 3 meters. If I choose to talk about this at the beginning, I can just mention it later to remind the audience. Which would make sense, since we already talked about how Solnhofen probably didn't have trees. You know, so, except without the cheese there. I think that's what I'm going to wind up doing. All right. It took me 3 tries to get the right number of E's in the word trees, And now the internet knows. Okay. The hyperextendable second toe has been showing up in illustrations for some time. That is the Deinonychosaur, or the dromaeosaur-looking position of this toe. I want to say that's a Greg Paul thing originally. He was comparing the anatomy of Archaeopteryx to Deinonychus and just posed it that way. But that's been borne out recently by the 10th specimen. The joint that, wait, how does this work? I know it's because it's got a, okay. Second toes, first phalanx. Okay, so that's the knuckle. Is it called a knuckle if it's on the foot? I don't know. High reaching groove. Okay. Yeah, so all I need to say is that, okay. The hyperextendable second toe, that dromaeosaur-looking, not sickle claw but held like a sickle claw, has been showing up in Archaeopteryx restorations for some time. I want to say that dates from Ostrom's comparison of Archaeopteryx to Deinonychus. I think Greg Paul popularized this one, but that's been borne out recently. The Thermopolis specimen again has the joint between the first and second phalanx of the first toe has a groove that extends really high up. So it actually would have been holding its toe this way, which makes sense. The reason that we were restoring it that way was phylogenetic bracketing showed us that, yeah, it probably would have that as its primitive condition, have that extendable second toe. So it's cool when new evidence confirms our hypotheses, or supports our hypotheses, I should say. I should add that part. I have occasionally seen the sentiment that paleontology is not a experimental science. I don't think that the people who say this have talked to paleontologists. Oh, pardon. Oh, this is so cool. Right. Cool. Okay. I don't usually get to talk about studies from the same frickin' year. There's a recent, very recent study on Anchiornis, where they shot lasers at the fossil to get a better look at it, specifically at the soft tissues that were preserved as traces. And they found that the bottoms of the feet of Anchiornis were tuberculate scales, like what you'd find on a bird or indeed a dinosaur. Should I say stem bird? I feel like I should just start saying stem bird, starting with this episode. I'm going to refer to non-avian dinosaurs as stem birds. I think that would be the smart thing to do. Because I'm going to be explaining what a stem bird is later on. All right, let's see. There's a very recent study, 2017 study, where they shot laser beams at an Anchiornis specimen to look at the traces of soft tissues that were preserved that you couldn't see with the naked eye. And they revealed some things about integument. They revealed that basal Paravians would have had tuberculate scales on the bottoms of their feet, much like a bird or any other dinosaur would have. They revealed that possibly Archaeopteryx and certainly Anchiornis would have had some kind of scaly covering on their ankle. So in light of the... Oh, that's why I'm mentioning this. Okay. I got hung up on the scales because the scales are cool to me, but the reason I'm mentioning this study is the foot pads. All right. There was a recent study in 2017 where they shot laser beams at a specimen of Archaeopteryx to get a look at the soft tissue traces that you couldn't see with the naked eye, and they found that there was a substantial foot pad. There was soft tissue padding the bottom of the foot of the creature. They also found that there were tuberculate scales there, just like a bird or just like a stem bird. And they found that there may have been, what do you call that? Tuberculate scales on the back of the ankle as well, though I'm not sure whether those can necessarily be extrapolated to Archaeopteryx, since they were sort of cautious about saying that, yes, these are scales. But in this case, the Papo comes out ahead as far as having some padding on the bottom of its foot. The safari toy is much more stick-like. Do. Oh, I cited Martin Week here because he said this, but I don't know where he got that information. Both these toys have the feathers stopping at or just above the ankle, but there's evidence that it should be feathered all the way down to the foot, maybe even having some kind of foot feathers like Archaeopteryx, although it wouldn't have the pugnacious sort of foot wing that we saw in, for example, Microraptor. What it did have was tibial wings. It had pugnacious feather trousers on its leg bones, which is not reflected in the Papo toy. The Papo toy doesn't even have pugnacious contour feathers on the legs. It seems to have just fuzz. Oh, no, I guess those are... What in the world kind of feathers are these? I don't know if you guys can see them. The camera's not focusing. It sort of gives way to, like, down. It's still clumpy, but it lacks Rocky? Either way, it's unclear that the leg feathers would have had any aerodynamic function. Oh, I have a citation for that. I can emphatically state that. It's unlikely that the leg feathers served an aerodynamic function, though. Now we get to talk about color. Again, largely thanks to Archaeopteryx, but that's okay. Let's see here. I will remind you all how cool it is that we can talk about color in a dinosaur. When I was a kid, color was something that we just would never know about dinosaurs because it doesn't preserve. Well, it does, but you have to use an electron microscope to see it, and even then you can only see certain kinds of color. Structural colors, they're called. Carney and colleagues looked at the counterslab of that original isolated feather for which Archaeopteryx is named, and they found that, wait, my notes go off screen. Oh, I'm just talking about the scanning electron microscope. The feather they looked at was one of these, the coverts that are attached to the hand or the finger. They're not exactly sure which one because obviously we don't have the rest of the animal to compare it to. The rest of that animal, I should say. And if you watched our feathers episode, you probably guessed what they found when they looked at it, and that is melanosomes. They found imprints and 3D structures of rod-shaped eumelanosomes, which the aspect ratio of them implies that the coverts, at least, were probably black. Now, that could be for display. Maybe it just was really great to have black coverts if you were an Archaeopteryx and you wanted to mate. The black coloration extends all the way up the feather, even including parts of the feather that were obscured by the other tracts. The word is tracts. But the color extends all the way up the feather, including parts of it that would be obscured by the previous tract. So if it was exclusively for display, that's overkill, isn't it? Melanin does protect against feather-degrading bacteria in living birds. So it could be an immune thing, whereas, want to start that one over, Stephen? I do want to start that one over, Stephen. Melanin offers some protection against certain bacteria which degrade feathers, but those bacteria are more of a problem in humid climates, whereas, as we've said, the Solnhofen ecosystem was pretty arid, so it's not clear that it would have been much of a selection pressure to keep your feathers from rotting. The most reasonable explanation we have is that the melanin was structural, or at least primarily structural. See also how both these toys have darkened wingtips. See, the melanin strengthens the keratin. It makes it less likely to fray. It, what does it do? Strengthens keratin structures, hardness, thickness, and resistance to fracture. Okay. The best explanation we have seems to be that this was structural, you know, in addition to the other things. This is also why you see darkened tips on otherwise light-colored feathers on both toys. This is reflective of something we see in living birds, where melanin is a large polymer, and it strengthens keratin. It makes it harder, thicker, and more resistant to fracture. Apparently Chris is testing a boat. Oh, okay. So it makes sense that I mentioned that before that, and I think it made sense, so I'm going to move that. Wait, why did I Miss Liz, did you hear that? Oh. Paper one. All right. Melanins are large polymers. They strengthen the keratin structures that they are bound to. They make them harder, more resistant to fracture, and they make them thicker. The that makes it interesting that the Papo toy doesn't have darkened tips on its rectrices. Now, obviously, it couldn't flap its tail, but tail feathers would still have taken a bit of a beating. Incidentally, I haven't mentioned posture yet. The fact that these are both standing on their tails, I'm almost willing to forgive. First off, the Papo one actually will, if you're careful, it will, can I get it to? It will stand on just its feet. And we're going to talk about later how the posture of these animals was in a transitional state between the horizontal center of gravity is at the hip posture of the more basal theropods and the sort of 45-degree center of mass is at the knee posture of birds. So this isn't a terribly unreasonable stance, even though, I mean, in life, it would not be able to support even its minuscule weight on its tail feathers, the way that the safari toy seems to be doing it. You'd think that since they put the reversed hallux on there, that's even less of an excuse to have it stand on its tail, because you've already got 2 tripods. Like, the problem with dinosaur toys is that if you want to get them to stand up on 2 legs, there's nothing to stop them falling backwards. But this toy, if you're going to make that concession to have that backwards facing toe, you might as well use it. What if I could bend it? Nope. You know, I didn't even put it in my notes because I thought it was so obvious. So let's see here. I'm just gonna add it onto the end. Yeah. Bear with me, I am an impossibly slow typist. So what I'm talking about here with iridescence, which I can never spell right, there we go. We had a study recently that I probably have a link to that Microraptor would have actually had iridescent feathers. They looked at a similar method looking at Microraptor feathers, and they found that its melanosomes had the appropriate structure for it to have iridescent feathers. And I don't know if you can really tell from the T3i here, but there's a sort of a blue, there's the black plastic, and then there's this slight metallic blue sheen on parts of it. And I think that's supposed to be representing iridescence, which, since Microraptor is more basal, I suppose it's not completely unreasonable to have iridescence on the on Archaeopteryx feathers. Ah. Let's see. I'm wondering if I should say something about how, like, the pepo seems to be based on some kind of jungle fowl, or maybe a, I don't know, a pheasant or a quail or something, whereas the safari is more like a magpie. And I don't really know which would be more accurate. I mean, based on its environment, it seems like it would be most reasonable to restore it like a seagull or something. Or maybe an osprey. You know what I haven't talked about is the color of the fleshy bits on the safari, where they're orange. Come to think of it, that's probably the most stereotypical color you could make them. I don't know whether to call that reasonable or not. I guess it is. We obviously don't have evidence for what color its scaly parts would be. And I suppose they could have been brightly colored. Plenty of birds have, you know, orange beaks. Oh my goodness, why do I keep forgetting this? Plenty of living birds have orange beaks and such like, so I should at least mention it, because it is a trope. If you want to present a dinosaur as bird-like, you give it orange feet. Yeah, I'll mention that. So we have both ends of the trope. We have the birdie dinosaur trope, and we have the dinosaur-y bird trope. Yay! Now we get into the arms and wings. Arms stroke wings, since they are both. Yeah, so I just talk about how the fingers and arms are proportioned. Should I talk about... I know I mentioned the propatagium down here. Should I mention it up here as well? Might as well. Yeah. See, now I gotta look, because I'm not actually sure if either of these really shows a propatagium. I guess this might? Propatagium, for those that don't know, is the fleshy bit on the front of a bird's wing. And as of the Archaeopteryx laser study, which is what I'm going to call that now, we know that was present at least before the AVA lay. So where is that? That would be the Eumannaraptora. It kind of looks like... the safari toy might have one, but since that study is so new, it's not reasonable to ask them to have that on these toys. But that's not really the premise of the show, is it? The premise of the show is that our understanding does change, and just because you didn't know about it at the time is not an excuse. It is no longer accurate. Also, I'm pretty sure these were sent to me after having been purchased fairly new. So they might still be manufacturing these. I don't know. That gets into, is the show really about the toys? And no, it isn't. It's about the dinosaurs. So I probably shouldn't even mention it. I'm just going to put a note that says Propatagium. And that's what we put. Let's see. So you might notice that the fingers and claws on the safari toy look much longer relative to the creature than the ones on the Papo toy. In fact, they're not really long enough. Especially the claws are too short. Archaeopteryx had massive hands for an animal its size. The Papo toy kind of suffers from the same trope that most Archaeopteryx fictions have, where the fingers are just sort of a dinosaur hand jutting out of the wing. Whereas the safari has shown the much more reasonable, the hand is part of the wing. The feathers, the primary feathers are anchored to the second finger and the hand. We don't have evidence of any feathering on the thumb of the creature, and both of these have done this thing where the third finger is crossing over the second. That is supported by the skeletons. The third finger in specimens is crossing the second, which tells us that it wasn't, anchored together with flesh the way that a more modern bird would be. Whether it would have supported feathers, I don't actually know. It looks like it doesn't on either of these toys, which, as far as I know, is fine. But again, the fingers are too short on both, especially on the Papo. There is no sign of the Propatagium that we now know would have been there. We don't know exactly what purpose it was serving, because in modern birds, it's essential to creating the airfoil that the wing produces. It's unlikely that Archaeopteryx would have been doing any real, soaring. So even though it shows up in the Eumannaraptora, it's not super resolved what purpose it was initially for. I guess it would have an aerodynamic purpose during wear, wing-assisted inclined running. Yes, David, just because you don't know something doesn't mean that you can say we don't know that. That's true. I suppose I should just say there's no evidence on these toys of the Propatagium. It looks like the wing feathers just kind of hug the front of the arm, whereas there should be a bit of a membrane going from shoulder to wrist, just like there is in modern birds. We know this based on the Anchiornis laser study. That serves minor aerodynamic purposes in a bird that probably wasn't flying around, but in more derived birds, it's absolutely essential. And I probably angered some people by saying that Archaeopteryx was not flying around, so let's talk about flight. The long but narrow pennaceous wing feathers were asymmetrical. The papotoi here has the primaries sort of curving at their tips, if that is supposed to be showing that the rachises, the quills are not super sturdy. That has been, what do we call that? Overturned by more recent evidence. The quills would be pretty much as stiff as you would expect a bird this size to have. It's possible that this is just an artistic representation of that thing birds do when they're extending their wing, where they pivot the feather around its base and sort of spread their feathers out. And if that's the case, that's fine. That's totally something it probably could have done and would have done if it was using its wings aerodynamically. Longridge proposed that this was a transitional animal, feather-wise, between Anchiornis's condition and like Confuciornis and the Pagastylian condition, where it has asymmetrical long flight feathers, but it also has very long coverts that are poorly differentiated from the flight feathers, as opposed to the clear differentiation that you see, and I'd need a graphic for that, in Confuciusornis and more derived Pygostylians. That's been criticized. This safari toy seems to be pretty rigorously based on a diagram from a previous study by Longridge before his coverts nearly as long as the flight feathers study. And that's been called out on taphonomic grounds again. So much of this comes down to, well, it might have looked like this in life, or maybe the feathers moved after it settled into the bottom. Because some of the criticism of that is that he reasoned that since the coverts are so long, it wouldn't be able to do what I think this one is implied to be doing, which is spread out its feathers and allow air to pass in between them. Because there would just be there would be feathers everywhere, even if it spread them out. If that's the case, that would restrict its ability to have any kind of flap stroke. Current thinking is that the coverts should be about like this, where they're little under half as long as the flight feathers. So in that respect, the papotoi comes out looking a little better, even though the overall aspect of the wing is much better on the safari, whereas the papo has a much more derived structure with these extremely elongate primaries. So, could it fly? Well, first you'll notice that it has pretty small wings for such a big bird. We reason that even though we've only found subadult specimens, we reason that it probably grew to about the size of a crow. It lacks an ossified sternum, and flapping flight requires pretty substantial musculature. Its shoulder socket has been the subject of some debate. There was studies saying that it just didn't have the range of motion to be able to flap its wings, but then we found that, well, its shoulder socket was a little higher on the creature than we previously thought. Also, maybe it wasn't doing a traditional full flap stroke like a modern bird does. Maybe it was doing some very specific flap stroke for its specific mode of locomotion, which may not have been flapping flight. Oh, I missed a chance. All right. But it was later found that the shoulder socket is higher on the creature than we had thought, so something approaching a flap is possible, especially if it's not doing a full modern bird-like flap. Maybe it's doing some other kind of locomotion. Maybe the shoulder muscles that are apparently rather small on this creature were made up for by having other muscles hypertrophied, which is totally possible, because remember, this isn't actually, even though it gets pigeonholed into being so, this is not actually the node between dinosaurs and birds. So it doesn't have to reflect a transition between running and flying. In fact, there was a recent study by Hutchinson and Allen where they had, I'm going to quote them directly, I think. If I could turn on word wrap, I would. View word wrap. The recognition that extant birds use varying degrees of aerodynamic forces in running and flying. Wait. Oh, I missed a whole line. I don't know if I want to... I haven't quoted directly from studies very often. At least if I do, it's only like a few phrases. But I kind of want to quote this whole frickin' sentence. I wonder if I could do like the other YouTube channels do and just show the text and have it light up as I say it or something. Because I really like the part where they're saying how attempts to define any one phylogenetic node as the transition between the two may be futile. Because that plugs directly into what I'm trying to argue, that we can't keep forcing Archaeopteryx to be this perfect idea of a transition between dinosaur locomotion and bird locomotion, or dinosaur anatomy and bird anatomy, because it wasn't. It was its own animal. Girl. Oh. Pardon me. Oh, I even used the word tokenism for this part. Hi there, Miniman0404. I have never tried Sublime Text 3. Oh, I didn't even talk about the ontogenic transitional wing. Yeah, I guess that could use some work, huh? All right. But since this is definitely one of the animals that is on that sequence of the transition from running to flapping, let's talk about the transition from running to flapping. The current theory is an evolution of the where hypothesis that I mentioned in Deinonychus episode. It's called the ontogenetic transitional wing. This is fancy biologist speak for partially evolved wings work like partially grown wings do today. Even a wing that's somewhat crappily feathered, so even something like Anchiornis, would provide some aerodynamic advantages, especially for a small animal or a juvenile, because they're going to be trying to navigate 3D substrate, or maybe they're trying to just add a little more oomph to a jump as they're evading a predator or capturing prey. It's an adaptation for moving in 3 dimensions, even if you're not actually flying in 3 dimensions. So even though the way Archaeopteryx moved doesn't necessarily represent the entirety of the transition between dinosaur locomotion and bird locomotion, it very much is in that mix. Put a question mark there because I'm not sure if I should use the word mix. I could use a fancy word like milieu. So here I've got a very detailed rundown of the transition from birds to dinosaurs, or scratch that, reverse it. I either need to condense it severely or figure out some kind of rough graphic to practice against, because what I could do is run through this whole thing and just, whenever I mention a node, like here we've got the node for paraves, here we've got Eomaniraptora, Aviala, Aviale? I don't know how you say AE when it's just AE and not the AE digraph, because that's E, but AE seems to be either A or E, depending on context. Pygostylians, Ornithothoraces, Euornithes, I guess. No idea what you call this one, and then aves. But I don't know if I should just say, well, this is what we had when we started, and this is what we have when we end, and Archaeopteryx is somewhat closer to where we started than where we ended. Or if I should run through this whole thing. I guess I should do a practice run and see how long it takes to say it, and see whether I want to commit to that much animation for this episode. But I don't have to do that right now. I'm going to run through this segment, which will not be the most entertaining thing in the world visually, because I'm not even pointing at the toy for it, but I want to see how that sounds. There's a town in Bavaria called Solnhofen, where we've been quarrying limestone for about 200 years, and we've been finding fossils in it for about 4,000 years. The rock there dates from the early Tithonian, which is the late Jurassic, 151 to 150 million years ago, which was an archipelago in what is today southern Germany and northern France. Due to continental drift, the archipelago was about where the Mediterranean is today, and the climate was warmer overall, which results in a hot, semi-arid, shallow sea dotted with islands and peninsulas. We have shallow lagoons in the area of Solnhofen that are sheltered from other basins by sponge reefs, huge sponge reefs that are 50 meters off the seafloor. So the water from the ocean is not mixing into these lagoons. So there were very long periods where the basins were isolated from the oceanic waters, which means that the salinity went crazy, and they were somewhat anoxic in the depths as well, so no animal life could live down there. We find arthropods, but not arthropod trackways. We found trackways of horseshoe crabs that end with the dead horseshoe crab in the substrate. So nothing was living down there. This is good for us, because any specimens that float down there do not get decomposed. And because it's not being disturbed by life forms, the rock doesn't get this coarse texture that other limestone has. This is why it's lithographic limestone. It's a very specific kind that's very fine-grained, homogeneous, it's very useful for what's called lithographic printing. Video link. I'm pretty sure the video, yeah, I have a film reel from like the early 20th century showing old-fashioned lithographic printing using Solnhofen limestone. It's kind of a cool process. I wonder if I could link that. Like here in the chat. Oh, it's not British Path, it's Periscope. If you're interested in seeing how that worked. Let's see here. So, because the animals that died and floated down onto this rock didn't decompose once they got down there, and because the saline content of the water actually helped to preserve them, you know, it basically pickled them, we have really excellent fossils from this time period. We have abundant, diverse insects. We have stem lizards. We have a stem tuatara, stem crocodilians, and of course stem birds, which include pterosaurs, Compsognathus, and Archaeopteryx. I don't know if I should mention this at this point. No. It's true, most Solnhofen stem bird fossils are of juveniles. So I don't know if that I don't know what that means though for the purposes of this episode, because it makes sense that baby pterosaurs would fall into the water because they're probably not the strongest flyers currently. But what does that imply for Archaeopteryx? There's actually a study talking about how, or a pair of studies by a single guy who seems very convinced that Archaeopteryx would be running on the water like a basilisk lizard or like a water bird taking off. But he hasn't found much support for this theory among the broader community. Though, in his defense, it would explain how Archaeopteryx gets out to sea to then float down and be preserved for us to come find. So we'll fast forward a brief 150 million years to 1836, when American paleontologist Edward Hitchcock reported trackways from Triassic New England, and he said that these were birds. Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because Martin Week mentioned it in his book. I don't really need to mention it. It's important to the narrative that he was giving, but it's not super important to my narrative. Like, I understand why I felt the need to write this down, because it's important to the history of birds are dinosaurs. I guess I could move it somewhere else. I can mention this like when I start to talk about how there's resistance to the idea of birds as dinosaurs. I can mention, hey, people have been suggesting this since before we knew what dinosaurs were. I seem to be running out of steam a little bit here. Maybe I should stop streaming and just revise my notes more. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to listen to my ramblings about dinosaurs. Make sure you check out our main channel to see more of my ramblings about dinosaurs and also some other less dinosaur-specific programming. And I hope to hear from you all, or I hope to see you all next time when hopefully I'll be actually doing animation work, which is probably going to be more entertaining. See you next time.